Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my podcast, That Other Laura Ingram. I'm, of course, Laura, and I'm coming to you. I'm just going to go straight into everything. And I'm coming to you at the end of a very tough week and a half at this point. It was last Monday that George Floyd was murdered by former officer Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis, Minnesota. You know, this has been a really heartbreaking time period in our nation and across the world, and it's led to such chaos, such deserved chaos. It's really hard to put words together to describe how you feel and the helplessness that comes from seeing the things that we've seen over the past week. I said on my Facebook the other day that social media, lately it's like, for your own emotional health, you should look away. But also for other people's well-being, you shouldn't. Not right now. That's how it's been. An unarmed man was publicly executed by Minneapolis police on Monday, May 25th, 2020. By now, the whole world knows the name of George Floyd, the man of color who was killed last Monday, as well as the name of his murderer, former officer Derek Chauvin, who is now charged with second-degree murder, and the three officers who at very least aided and abetted, two of which should surely be charged with also at least third-degree murder, who you don't hear named very much. So I'll go ahead and name them now. Tu Tao, as well as Thomas Lane and J. Alexander King, respectively. As what tends to happen when we see these sorts of things, a lot of people were outraged from the very beginning. But there was nowhere that these murderers were going to be able to hide from justice, no matter where they tried. The riots were even larger than the president could even outrun, as protesters marched on the White House after 2 days of looting and destruction levied on Minneapolis. With our bold, gracious, ultimately pathetic president cowering in his bunkers and then sending the military out to bully protesters so he could appear otherwise and hold a Bible in his hand and stand in front of an establishment he never attends otherwise. If you missed that social media gold, I'm sure you'll see it. The picture of Trump in front of the church holding the Bible. It'd be hilarious if it weren't for the time that we're going through right now. Myself, as best as I could, as a single mom with my children home, I sided with those protesters. Demand justice, demand first-degree charges, move to convict. And I still side with them. I wrote my blog post stating all of this, and I defend them. I defend anti-fascists, and I decry the extremist white supremacy militias, such as the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys, who posed as Antifa allies to the protesters, but then carried out violence and started most of the violent rioting that we saw. But now that a week has almost passed, the conversation for a lot of people, especially as some of the rioting has affected local communities and businesses across the nation, the conversation gets bigger and there are more facets and also more judgment. And a lot of that judgment is racially inclined. So this conversation is a tough one to have. And for me, I would never play devil's advocate to the other side of this. But being able to get an understanding for other people's viewpoints and trying to build bridges is something I've always tried to do. So where exactly do I start? I've discovered I am an anarchist at heart. It's always my first position, even if rationally I know better. And as a mother, I have both learned to also look out for this in myself because it is such a rash place to start from, and also to use that very fire to defend my children when they still remain small and ignorant of how teachers and school administration have treated them sometimes, especially in the presence of only the other Hispanic parent. And I've taken on that cultural heritage myself because they come from me. And that's such a tightrope to walk sometimes. So let me begin first with my first reaction to seeing the video of George Floyd being slowly and helplessly murdered by police. And that was to wonder why no one seemed to run for help. Then again, how could you leave an innocent dying man? But my first thought was to see myself there. If I had come upon this scene, or if I had even been one of his friends, my immediate first instinct would have been to expose what was going on to anyone who could have immediately stepped in. I thought maybe I'd even start at the closest arms dealer, if I could find one. But either way, I'd go shop to shop, telling everyone where to find the cops that were carrying out a public execution on an unarmed black man. Or I'd take a live public video with the address, with restaurants and stores tagged right then and there, immediately, and not just the day afterwards. Maybe he wouldn't have died. So those were my first thoughts. What happened was so very wrong. Chauvin at least definitely knew what he was doing, and Floyd's friends had no one there to help. They just had to watch and plead, and I'm sure it was so much more horrible for them than it was for anybody else watching. I posted these feelings on my personal social media and made them private not too long afterwards because I felt so upset and I was worried I was saying something that wouldn't at all help and just might make things worse. And it ended with the feeling that none of us should have to do this, but it's becoming clearer and clearer that we need to think ahead and know the right words and actions to use against out-of-control government in the very moment we find it. We need to know ahead of time what we're going to say and do, and we need to find ways to flip the script and take control in an instant. Those were my first thoughts. But after a lot of watching and inward reflection. I also feel that taking back control is something that requires real, pointed, rational messages. So here comes the controversial part. Me wincing, knowing it's not my right to have an opinion on the realities of other people, on how they feel about it. However, here is my offering. Let me put it that way. It's an offering. In labeling Floyd or anyone else as a black man who was unarmed, innocent, but publicly executed by police, I don't think black changes the seriousness of that message at all. And though I also, as a mother, hear that pain and feel that pain in the wake of this, I have seen videos and accounts spring up of this happening to all sorts of people. Although clearly the statistics spike for those who have darker skin color. And to be honest, if you've kept hearing me out, I've dealt with police brutality. 9 years ago, cops snatched me out of my home in front of my children and family, pushed me to the ground, and told me not to move. With my children watching, they and a bounty hunter that was with them had assault rifles pointed at me. They had no warrant, but they had the wrong house, and I fit the description. Kind of. Blonde and white were really about it. So, before divisions fester further, and before the powers that be further use that against us, I think we must also make the argument that what happened is wrong even without race. No matter how much many of us may want to make that argument, because we believe it will somehow protect others. And that's where I stand. That's my feelings. Those were my initial feelings from the beginning. Floyd's skin color probably, most definitely, may have been a factor for this person's hate and murderous intent. It seems undoubtedly that that was the case, but that is not the largest rational reason why this is wrong. It is an individual intent, an individual prejudice, and an individual wrong. There are so many worse overarching wrongs and the implications here of our executive branch's abuse of power. And we must try to realize, I think, that these wrongs have nothing to do with the concept of race, apart from its use by that same government as centuries-long propaganda. We live in a country where the government itself has perpetuated that fallacy, and in turn, the violence directly feeding on that fallacy of race. How? Why am I saying any of this? Ask any biologist. Race is only a social construct. There is no real biological basis for it. The philosopher Voltaire once said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." So if you're angry because you feel like you are part of the same race as this poor man, George Floyd, I get that. I feel that. But check that anger for a moment, just a moment, and make a better argument. Make a better argument for yourself. because this isn't about me. This is what I see and what I'm begging, what I'm offering. I guarantee you, even if your skin pigment is exactly the same hue, you have various other beautiful shades of humanity in your genetics. Don't play into the very thing that is harming you, the very thing feeding into all the prejudice, that belief in race. Instead, make people stop using terms like race and racism to describe people altogether, because those terms are exactly the same thing. Believing in race, if race doesn't exist, believing in it, believing in race is racism. And that is clearly the fault of the government that we have allowed ourselves to feed into. But none of that information makes what's happening any less wrong. It was wrong for many reasons, but the three biggest reasons why this was wrong, let's remember. The three biggest universal reasons why this was wrong is because, one, it was wrong for the government to have segregated people in the first place. It was wrong to have segregated them with a perpetuated lie, this lie of race, for centuries. It was an absurdity, like Voltaire once said, that we have allowed ourselves to believe, which has inspired many to commit atrocities. Number two reason why this is wrong. This most current atrocity is wrong because no citizen should be afraid that their executive branch of government will decide to enact a public execution upon an unarmed man without judge and jury. Anything like that is a government that is out of control, and we need to demand better of it. Number three reason why this is wrong. It was murder. It was clearly murder. And murder is wrong. So lately I refuse to call people racist. Not because I don't feel for those who identify with others who have been unjustly killed or harmed, especially if it involves some physical prejudice like skin color. I am part of a minority group and the victim of violence myself, but I refuse to even acknowledge race anymore because I have seen every atrocity is wrong for so much worse reasons. And that belief in a lie only gives it more power to harm. It only further perpetuates the myth by which people have built their prejudices. There's a meme going around, perhaps you have seen. On one side, it shows Derek Chauvin kneeing a grounded and defenseless George Floyd in the back of the neck, while the other shows the practice of football quarterback Colin Kaepernick taking to his knee to send Americans the message that Black lives matter. The text at the top reads, "This is why." And the meme truly makes an impact. It's very powerful. I feel the pain of it and why many, even before all this happened, want to make this message hit home. So I completely don't have a problem with Kaepernick's ritual or beliefs. Kaepernick's kneeling to me is meaningful despite this more rational outlook that may come off as dismissive. Let's get that out. I want to make sure that that comes out because it's definitely meaningful. It means a lot to a lot of people, and people have feelings that need to be dealt with. People grieve. People mourn. But perhaps, as I brought up this meme, some of what I said just a few moments ago stood in contrast to it. And maybe you felt that. Perhaps some of what I've already said helps people understand why some people do have their issues. Maybe the path is lit up that illuminates why some don't understand or are still upset by Kaepernick's kneeling in protest of his own subjective government lie-founded bias, perpetuating lie-based tension and perpetuating the very lie itself. And this is all also in addition to being furious at the murderous kneel of Derek Chauvin into George Floyd's vulnerable, clearly lacking resistance, breathing passageway. If you're still not sure why people could feel varying levels of upset for both pictures, hold on. I still have a little bit more for this conversation. And again, I understand, I feel it. But it's always my desire to try and build a bridge and start a conversation, knowing that it is one of the only ways to find peace in these situations without violence. Not everyone knows how to express their feelings and lay them out rationally. And I don't think the answer is to tell people that they should be able to, and that they should be able to understand everyone's feelings, and that they should be able to open up. I do feel like they should be able to, but if they can't, there's probably reasons why. And so rationality and truth are the most important things that we can dig out of these events. They are the only way to solve the problems. To me, when you look at this entire situation with George Floyd, police brutality, no matter your identity, whether you are right-wing or left-wing, this is the same thing Americans have been fighting against from the very beginning. The problem isn't simply a race problem. It's a problem with police brutality carried out with extreme, extreme prejudice. I side with Black Lives Matter because I feel that pain that they are feeling. But I don't side with the underlying philosophy of calling more and more attention to a particular identity. If I were to give a suggestion as a transgender person who literally cannot use their identity to fight anything because it is so hated and misinterpreted, and as a mom to Hispanic children, and as a white woman who can have that privilege as long as she never mentions her most hated identity, my three identities combined, those experiences, if I could give a suggestion based on those things, I would suggest more our lives before our color is more how I see the anger of Black Lives Matter. Whether I'm seen as an ally or not, I am. I don't care about how anyone feels about me or my stake in this, because that's been my own learned behavior over the past 10 years since transitioning. I have 2 children to care for and to protect. And their story of ethnicity on that side of the family, and that they take with them as they grow, that story isn't any easier. I feel for the pain, but the cause itself, as it is, I think relies on segregation and only segregates more over time. But we need its voice right now at the same time. At the same time, people grieve. People with Black skin color are grieving. And that's the reality. That's real. The moment you present this as a race problem, you gain care immediately. People hate prejudice. If I put out my transgender identity in any situation and the violence surrounding that, the status quo cares for a time. But when they have to deal with my reality day to day, that care and understanding and empathy isn't really there most of the time. It was just sympathy all along. They can't relate. So I don't expect them to. I don't expect that. I don't expect that concern to last ever. I wouldn't expect it to be there even if this was a Hispanic nation or a Black nation. It's rarely really there for people who regularly identify as trans, I've learned. You point out the injustices and gain sympathizers, but as people start to see conflict spreading, it becomes an us versus them moment, and people instinctually defend their core self and the things that they can relate to. I'm not saying that there is no prejudice against people's skin color, because there definitely is. Just like prejudice against gender. But unlike gender, it is fueled by this dividing line that race itself draws all on its own, as a concept that is biologically untrue. Why draw that line? I understand there's this feeling that it must be drawn, but I don't think it does. When someone is treated with prejudice because of their skin color, there comes all these race-fueled excuses available for people in defense of their own race, and all of our interconnectedness becomes lost. People ask the wrong questions, horrible questions, questions related to race crimes within a specific race community, pointing fingers to racially charged rioting and reactive violence. All of these things begin with the concept of race, even if none of them stick to the feelings of any particular race as an identity. Mentality begins with how we speak about things. Whole cultural traditions are influenced from the beginning by their language. And we segregate each other just by buying into this fake concept of race and adding that to our vocabulary, even though it isn't at all biologically true. We are a human race. Standing against fascism, fear of the police state, fighting police brutality, extremism, and corruption. Those are American values that Americans can relate to. Those are human values, I think. Shout about human life. And demand the government remove race from the census and other demographic surveys. Demand segregation end. And demand violence ends. Those things are universal. Even on the far right, the reason those militia groups that we're all afraid of exist is because of the Second Amendment. Their racial hatred comes from being given the vocabulary for it. Take it away from them, and over time, they're just fighting corrupt government for all of us. Keep feeding those groups with segregation, this segregative vocabulary, and keep letting the government use these words, and those meatheads that are drawn to those groups will draw whatever conspiratorial conclusions they feel like. And race and all its demographic data will always be right there for them to try and use. I'll end this with a little science, some physics, because if this is systemic, we can call it race and racism or anything else, but we have to realize how systems work, knowing this is systemic. In physics, we talk about forces and even graph them as vectors. as lines going in one direction. And forces are a big part of what makes up systems. We talk a lot about equality in this conversation, but the thing that we don't realize a lot is that systems are always in equilibrium. Without equilibrium, they wouldn't exist. So we have to understand the difference there. If we look at race as a problem, we are looking at separate races, separate forces that are existing in equilibrium already. But no, they're clearly not equal. They have different magnitudes, different populations, different amounts of power that drive that force for each so-called race. And we're so concerned on how to change that magnitude for these racial forces, but biologically, they don't even exist. Blacks and Native Americans and Asians can all work together to oppose one issue, but they don't always align on every issue, and so then they work against each other. And so then you swap out some identities for other identities if you can. Sexual identities or family identities, but somehow the system remains in equilibrium until suddenly it doesn't, like what we had this past weekend. And what happens when it doesn't? Well, in physics, the stronger force tends to find equilibrium by just inadvertently falling and crushing. And then everyone is in equilibrium on the ground. And is that what people want? To go back to ground level and refight every old fight? Possibly end up back in a dark age? Why virtualize things this way? This can only end badly. Our system at the ground level is already in equilibrium. A conversation of race virtualizes it. But that system remains in equilibrium. So why allow that virtual system of race to affect what's on the ground? In fact, it won't. You're buying into a conflict that was created by that ground level system and the problems in that ground level system that we can take care of without race. If we all identify it, if we all focus on identifying those problems and make things better for all of us, because we're all human and we all want peace. I believe Black Lives Matter wants peace. I believe that what most people want is peace. I think that those ideas are universal. Love is universal. And so again, I love you guys. Thank you for listening. You have a great rest of your week. So you're aware, I am in the process of creating a Patreon for this episode. I would never post it on Patreon, even if I had one. I would just put it out because I feel like it's an important conversation to have, and that's what I do. However, keep an eye out for that. Also, if you haven't listened to it yet, the third episode, which might actually be posted after this episode, out of order, only because this is such an important episode. The third episode, which is already recorded, is going to be a reading of the foreword of my book, and it's going to begin that whole part And every once in a while, as I do this podcast, I will read another chapter of it. And I think I'll only be reading the first part of the book, but we'll see. Anyways, thank you for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and look out for that other episode. Follow the podcast. Follow me on Podbean or on Buzzsprout or on Spotify. You can go to my YouTube channel, and I post the podcasts on YouTube as well. So anywhere. Again, my blog is blog.jwtgirl.com. Thank you for listening, and take care. Love you.